So here we are again for the last part of the story of Joseph. I'm going to give you a quick summary of where we've come from. So Joseph, as a boy of about 17, was living back there in Canaan. Now God had given Joseph dreams when he was younger, dreams that he'd shared with his brothers and his parents. Dreams which seemed to indicate that one day Joseph would, if you like, be in charge, would rule over them. Now his older brothers did not like him at all. They were very jealous of him. But his older brothers were very different from Joseph. You know, Joseph was a very loving and caring young man. He respected his father. He was very obedient to his father. Whereas his older brothers, they tended to do what they pleased. They didn't seem to care very much at all for their father. And they certainly didn't care about Joseph because they actually sold him to traders. And the traders took him down to Egypt, where he was sold as a slave. And he was bought by a man called Potiphar, who was captain of Pharaoh's guard. While working for Potiphar, he proved a very hard worker, a very wise man, and Potiphar's household prospered greatly under Joseph's management. You see, Joseph, although this bad thing had happened to him, Joseph was a man who trusted in God. Even as a young man, he was trusting in God. And he knew that God was with him. And the evidence of that was the fact that God actually blessed everything that he did. Now, even though Potiphar had prospered really well under Joseph's management, Potiphar's wife was not such a nice woman. She lusted after Joseph, and because Joseph didn't comply with her wishes, she lied about him, and Joseph ended up in prison, the top security prison, where Pharaoh's own prisoners were kept. Again, so that's an even worse condition now. He's now in prison for years. It's not like the prisons of today. Who knows how often he had a chance to wash or change. So it was a pretty horrible place, and yet he still gave his best, and God still was with him, and God blessed him even there in prison. Now we know that he was released from prison after telling Pharaoh, giving Pharaoh an explanation about some dreams that he had had. And so Joseph was brought out of prison, and he ended up becoming Pharaoh's prime minister. He was in charge of everything that took place in Egypt because Pharaoh believed the interpretation that Joseph had given, and the interpretation had come from God, who had given Pharaoh the dreams in the first place. And the dreams indicated that there were going to be 7 really good years of harvests, and then there was going to be 7 years of terrible famine. So Joseph was in charge of preparing for that and in coordinating everything and in running the relief effort throughout the 7 years of famine. So we've also seen how Joseph's brothers had come from Canaan for food because there was no food in the lands around Egypt, and they had come for food, and Joseph had not revealed himself to his brothers. In fact, they didn't recognize him at all. He was obviously dressed very differently because he's the number 2 man in all of Egypt. So he'd be dressed very lavishly. And he spoke to them through an interpreter all the time. Anytime he was speaking to his brothers, he spoke through an interpreter. So they had no idea who he was, but he knew exactly who they were. Now, Joseph had actually forgiven them at this point for what they had done, because Joseph believed that this was God's will. This was God's plan. This was what the dreams were talking about that he'd had when he was a boy. He had been placed in this place of high honour, great power. And here were his brothers who'd come for food, and the first thing that they did when they arrived in his presence was to bow before him, which again was indicated in the dreams that Joseph had had as a boy. So he understood that this was the will of God, and he'd forgiven his brothers. knowing that they had just played a part in bringing him to Egypt. Now, what they had done was wrong, because they had done it for bad reasons, for selfish reasons, because they hated him. But God had just used that, and God had brought Joseph here to Egypt to do this very important job. So Joseph decided, though, he was going to test his brothers. He wanted to see if they changed, and so he puts in place this plan where he will send his brothers home with supplies, but they must bring back their youngest brother, Benjamin. Now, Benjamin was a full brother of Joseph. He was a half-brother to the older brothers. Now, we learned that Jacob did not want Benjamin to go with them, but he had to give in because they, again, were running out of food. So they came back, and, Joseph put in place the last part of his plan. He planted something, a silver cup. His own personal silver cup was planted in Benjamin's bag as the brothers set off home for the second time. And then Joseph sent his manager to catch up with the men and accuse them of theft, of stealing Joseph's personal cup. And the punishment was that the one whose bag contained the cup would be a slave in Egypt, and the other brothers could go home. And so they come back. Benjamin is the one in whose sack the cup had been placed, and so Benjamin is the one who has to remain in Egypt as a slave. Now, all the brothers are horrified because they had promised their father that Benjamin would be kept safe and they would bring him back safely. And so there we were. And so I want to continue this story now from Joseph's perspective, as we've done in the past. So let's think now of the remainder of our story today. So there I was. I could see a change in my brothers. They clearly didn't want me to keep Benjamin as a slave. And what was even more impressive was the fact that Judah stepped forward. He represented his brothers. And he actually offered himself as a substitute for Benjamin. He, even though he had family back home, he was willing to take Benjamin's place. He was willing to take Benjamin's punishment, to be a slave, if Benjamin could go home. So that he showed clear concern for Benjamin. He also showed clear concern for his father. He knew that if Benjamin didn't go home, then his father would die from grief. He'd seen how his father suffered greatly when he believed that Joseph was dead, when I was dead. Because his brothers, my brothers had told father that they'd found my multicoloured coat covered in blood, and clearly father believed that I had been killed by some wild animals. So father had suffered greatly at the loss of his beloved son Joseph. So I could see that there was a change, and as we've thought already, I cleared the room. I told everybody to get out of the room, and I wanted to be alone with my brothers. Now nobody else knew what was happening here. And as soon as everybody else was out of the room, I just broke down. I broke down and I wept. This was such a relief to get to this point where I could now reveal myself to my brothers, because that's what I wanted to do. I was desperate to reveal myself to my brothers, to just share with them. And, well, they were already standing in amazement because they couldn't understand why I was crying, why I was weeping. And then I said to them, "Brothers, it's me. It's Joseph." You see, remember, I had been speaking to them through an interpreter up until now, but now I spoke to them in their own language. And you should have seen their faces then. The shock, the horror, the fear in their eyes as they looked at one another. Can it be Joseph? But I said, look, it's all right. Don't be concerned. Don't be concerned. I've forgiven you. I've forgiven you long ago. I know that this was the will of God. You didn't know that when you sold me. But God has revealed that to me. This was his will. Remember the dream. Remember the dreams that I told you about when I was a boy. This is the fulfillment of those dreams. Here I am in this powerful position so that I might save this nation, our family as well, and the peoples round about. And yeah, you should have seen, there was great relief in their faces. And I remember Benjamin, his face just beamed. And I just went and I hugged Benjamin. I just hugged him. And I gave my brothers each a kiss on a forehead. You know, I just gave them that kiss just to show them that, you know, I had forgiven you. I have forgiven you. And we spent a bit of time together. But, you know, I was desperate. I was desperate for them to go home and to bring Father and the family back here to Egypt. And I told them that they needed to go soon. They needed to go quickly. Well, Pharaoh had also heard about what was going on. You know, it had been reported to him that they'd heard me crying, well, they heard about the joy I was having, and it was reported that I had been reunited with my brothers. And Pharaoh sent his best regards. And Pharaoh said, you know, give them wagons to take home so that they might be able to bring their families back here quickly. And so we prepared them. We got the wagons ready. We got the supplies ready. I had gifts. I gave each of my brother a new set of clothes. I gave Benjamin 5 sets of clothes. I also gave him 300 pieces of silver. Just something special, you know. And I'd also got 10 male donkeys and 10 female donkeys, and these were loaded with the best of products from Egypt, and with plenty of supplies and bread and whatever else was needed for the journey home and the journey back here to Egypt. And so the brothers set off, and it would have been great just to be able to watch them as they headed back there to Father and Canaan. Well, how I would love to have seen that reaction. They told me about it when they got back home. You know, Father was just delighted to see all the brothers were back, and that they had also got grain. He was a bit puzzled at all the other things as well, though. But you know, their faces were shining, and they said, "Dad, you'll not believe this. Joseph's alive. We've seen him. He's the man that's in charge of Egypt. Joseph, your son. He's not dead." Oh, Father just broke down with joy and tears. Joseph's alive. You know, they hadn't seen such joy since the days before he'd seen that coat covered in blood. He hadn't been the same man, but now that joy was restored. Well, there was a lot of preparation to do. They had to gather all the herds, all the goats and sheep, and pack everything up, and they set off to come down here to Egypt. Now on the way, Father decided to stop in Beersheba because he wanted to offer sacrifices to God, and he did so. And the night that they spent in Beersheba, God actually gave Father a vision. He told him, you know, there was no need to fear, Jacob. No need to fear about going down there to Egypt. I'm going to be there with you. That's what he assured them of. And he told them that, you know, there in Egypt is where your family will become a mighty nation, a great nation. You know, that was a promise that was given to his grandfather, Abraham, that they would become a mighty nation. It was going to happen here in Egypt. He also told them that he would die in Egypt, but that I would be by his side, and I would be the one who would close his eyelids. Well, as the family were nearing Egypt, Father sent Judah off to meet me. They wanted to know exactly where they were going to set up home. So when Judah arrived, we set off on my chariot. I couldn't wait to get beside Father. I couldn't wait to see his face. I couldn't wait to give him that hug. And we directed him. I got off that chariot, and I just ran to Father, and I just hugged him. And I must have hugged him for ages. I just didn't want to let him go. 15 years. 15 years. And I just hugged him and kissed him. It was such a tremendous experience. And the joy that Father had, and all the family, how things had changed. And it was just so good, so good. Sometime after that, I took 5 of my brothers to meet with Pharaoh. And Pharaoh confirmed when they told him that they were shepherds. Pharaoh confirmed that Goshen, the region where we'd placed them, that Goshen was indeed the best place for them to be as shepherds, and that it had the best of pasture. And he even asked that they might take care of his own livestock, and so that would happen. So I then introduced Father to Pharaoh, and Father immediately blessed Pharaoh and thanked him for the kindness, and he chatted, and then as he left, he again just gave a blessing to Pharaoh. And so the family settled well in Egypt, and we had 5 years of famine still to come, but I made sure that I took care of the family well. They had plenty of food and supplies to see them through that famine. And as for the nation of Egypt and the nations around about, there was plenty of provision. God had given me the wisdom, the ability to store away all this food, and there was plenty of provision for everybody to see them through the famine. And we settled well. And so that's effectively the end of that part of the story. Jacob was 130 years old when he arrived in Egypt. At the age of 147, Jacob died. And indeed, Joseph was by his side. And as God had said, Joseph was the one who closed his father's eyelids. The family indeed did grow whilst they were there in Egypt. Jacob's body was taken. Joseph and the family took Jacob's body back to Canaan to bury it in the place where he desired to be buried. It was something I feel like the family cemetery. It was back there in Canaan, and that's where he was buried. Joseph also died there in Egypt, and he again had asked that his body, his remains, his bones would be taken out of Egypt and buried in Canaan. You see, Joseph knew that the family weren't going to remain in Egypt forever, because the promised land that God had given was actually the land of Canaan. So there would come a time where the people of Israel would leave Egypt and go to the land of Canaan. But that is another story, and we'll leave that for another time, God willing. Well, but let's think again about some lessons from the story. So I want to go back to the evidence that the brothers has changed, right? That I want to think, especially to begin with, about Judah. Judah was willing to substitute himself for Benjamin. And when I was reading that, it made me think again about Jesus. You see, that's exactly what Jesus did, but on a much grander scale. Judah wasn't a perfect man, right? By no means. He was one of the brothers who'd sold Joseph. But when we get to that part of the story, Judah was actually willing to give up his life to save Benjamin. Well, Jesus, the Lord Jesus, came from heaven. He was the perfect man. He was born into this world, the perfect child, a child without sin. He lived the perfect life, a life that was a constant delight to God the Father. That means that there was never a moment in his life that he sinned. Not even a thought, not a word, not an act was committed by the Lord Jesus. He was the perfect man, and he had to be perfect because he'd come here to be the sacrifice for sin. He came to be our substitute. You see, he knew that we were all sinners. We had sin within us. We committed sin. All the bad things we think and say and do is sin in the sight of God. And Jesus, the Son of God, he knew that there was no way that we could get rid of our sin. There was nothing we could do to have our sins forgiven. Nothing that we could do for ourselves. And as a result, he knew that death would bring judgment, judgment would bring punishment, and therefore there was no hope for mankind. But the plan of God was this, that Jesus would come. He would take our place, and that's what happened on the cross. Jesus took our sins. Jesus took our judgment. Jesus took our punishment. And he died as our sacrifice on that cross. And now God can say, if you turn away from your sin and you trust in my Son, now I can forgive you. And now you can be reconciled to me. You can become indeed my children and dwell forever with me. So that's why Jesus had to be our substitute. It's a wonderful thing. And I hope you will accept him as your substitute. Let's think about the fact that Joseph saw this great change in his brothers. Remember, the brothers who had sold him, the brothers who almost came close to killing him. They wanted to kill him originally, but that was not the will of God. They sold him as a slave. So they were selfish men. They were men who had no care either for Joseph or for their father. But now they had changed. And now I'm speaking to those who have trusted in Jesus, or those who are even thinking about trusting in Jesus. When you become a believer, when you become a Christian, there should be a change. God says there should be a change. You are not the person you used to be. You do not think the way you thought before. You do not say the things you said before or say it in the way you said it before. You do not do the things you did before. You live differently. Morally, you change. You become more like the one you have trusted in. You become more like Jesus. You do his will, God's will, not your selfish will, not your greedy, lazy will. You do God's will. So there's a change. And finally, I want to think about how Joseph had trusted in God and accepted his will. We saw this throughout the story of Joseph. Joseph trusted in God as that young boy back in Canaan. He trusted in God when he was a slave for Potiphar. He trusted in God when he was a prisoner. And he trusted in God when he was released from prison, when he became the Prime Minister of Egypt. He trusted in God. He accepted God's will, even when things did not go well. You see, God never promises his people, his followers, his believers, Christians, he never promises them an easy life, a carefree life, a comfortable, selfish life. That's not his will. God actually tells us that as Christians, things are going to be hard. Just look at Jesus. He was the perfect man, and look what people did to him. They hated him. God says there are people in the world who are going to hate you. Now, there are plenty of people in our world who hate Christians, who despise Christians and despise the things they believe. But as God's people, we need to live for Him. And we need to accept His will. So when things do go bad, we don't become bitter and we don't fall into despair. We just trust in Him. That's what Joseph did. He went through plenty of horrible experiences. Experiences that you would call unfair. He went through those experiences, but he kept trusting in God. Now, there are plenty of other characters. We've thought about this in previous stories. People who experienced horrible things, but they kept trusting in God. And God saw them through it. And even some of them had experienced the worst of all. Their lives were eventually taken from them. They were murdered for their faith. But you know what? They knew that beyond the grave, there was life forever in the presence of God. So I want to end things there. I truly appreciate anyone who has listened throughout this series on the story of Joseph, and I'm looking forward to sharing further stories in the future. Perhaps we will look at the children of Israel at some point later on as well. But thank you again for coming and listening to these stories.